Good morning, all. I take it that we can start with the session. My name is Wynand Engelbrecht. I am the Group Fire Chief for Fire Operations Pty Limited, or in short, Fire Ops SA. Am I not supposed to see my guests?
They are there.
They are there. Okay, I'm taking it that you are all there.
23 or not.
So with that short introduction, I want to start the session, and the topic this morning is the base documentation that we require for compliance in terms of the National Building Regulations. Now, it's a big topic, and I expect there will be some serious questions afterwards. I'm going to speak freely on the topic. There's no specific detailed agenda. So what I'm going to deal with is the term compliance, and then I'm going to speak on certificates of occupancy and fire clearances and flammable liquid permits and all of the documentation that's required that the insurer will either request at some stage from their client during the assessment for the purpose of insurance, or after the fact, after the fire. And mostly it's after the fire that the client realized that they had not complied, and then, of course, the insurer, which the brokers and the insurers is probably 3/4 of this audience, will then require proof after the fact. So I'm going to start with the term compliance. So I consult widely for private clients and for insurers, brokers, mining groups, and just about every field of fire risk. And the one term that I too often hear when I sit down for a discussion, the very first statement almost by the client is, Wynand, we want to be 100% compliant. And then I ask them, compliant with what? And they say, well, all aspects of the law, which I think mostly they then mean the National Building Regulations. So just in short, the National Building Regulations were passed. We finalized it between 1987 and 1990. So we roughly refer to buildings that were constructed before 1990 and after 1990. That's kind of the dividing line, the watershed line. So back at the statement, we want to comply. And mostly when I walk in the main gate, I can see that this building is not going to comply ever. There are just things that you cannot change about a building, especially if it was erected before 1990. And so to make that statement is, sometimes it's a pipe dream, really. I think it's a good idea. The premise is good, but the outcome isn't always possible, even if you rationalize, and we'll get to the rationalization as well. And so to comply means that you can tick all the boxes. That's what compliance means in the first instance. And I find it mostly impossible. And then I advise my clients and I say that if you want to go down that route, you have to declare all the shortcomings. And when it comes back to you in writing in a report, you can't really hide it, because now it's out in the open, it's now in a white light, and it will be scrutinized after the fire, that fact. After the fire, the insurer, as you know, appoints a fire investigator, and sometimes I'm the investigator myself. I just never investigate fires that we fought as fire ops. For instance, we are right now at a house fire, and us attending that fire, I will not be the investigator for that fire. So when an investigator is appointed, there are 3 questions or 3 instructions that I normally receive from the insurer. The one is we want to know what's the origin of the fire, and what was the state of the building the moment before the fire broke out in terms of the National Building Regulations. Now that's the catch point. That is the loophole. That's where the tire really hits the tar. So compliance is it's a bit of a trick question, trick term, which has to be really well understood. Now we can comply by doing precisely as the building regulations prescribe. It's called DTS, deemed to satisfy. If you do those things, it's deemed that you satisfied the regulation. Or if we cannot satisfy the regulation in any respect, then we can rationalize that particular point. But if you rationalize, then the entire building must be considered in the rational design, not just one point. And then the third possibility is when we work with a material or an aggregate that we think is not properly defined in the NBR, we can take that product or a process or a procedure or an installation and take it to Agrement, which is an agency in the CSIR, and we can have that product or installation thoroughly tested, and the Agrement will then issue a certificate and say, in this specific instance, this can be used in this building. So it's something that's very costly. It's time consuming. I've been involved with such a submission, and it's taken us 7 years, and it's cost close to 3 million rand for that submission. So it's a very costly and time consuming thing. So here we're going to concentrate in this morning on DTS, deemed to satisfy, and rational design. If you'll excuse me when I take a sip of water, every now and then I am diabetic and my mouth is chronically dry. So cheers. So we've touched on compliance and the term compliance now. So I want to move over from compliance, and we're going to really be moving between these two terms, compliance and rational design, all the time during the morning. I don't want to get too technical with rational designs. Firstly, I'm not a fire engineer, or I'm not EXA registered. I'm a fire consultant, but that doesn't mean that I may not discuss the term. And so when you appoint an engineer for a rational design, the engineer must be registered with EXA, and there are various categories of engineering in the engineering disciplines that EXA would consider an individual. And if they decide that they may be involved with fire rational designs, then they get a letter from EXA that states that this individual may be involved with fire rational designs. So that's the engineering side of it. So they then concentrate and they create a rational design in terms of British Standard 7974, which you don't have to remember, but that's the basis of it. And that prescribe how they must get to work and what the methodologies are and so on to get to the answer. So let's take a typical example. So since around 2014, 15, in the city of Joburg, specifically, the water delivery in the council mains is rather poor. So the requirement of the building regulation is that a hydrant must deliver 1,200 liters a minute for 60 minutes at 3 bar pressure. So the council mains, mostly in the city, cannot deliver that. And if it can't deliver it, then the onus goes over to the building owner to provide their own water. And then we've got to create a water tank or a reservoir of at least 72,000 liters and install a pump that will give us the 3 bar pressure at the furthest hydrant. And if there are more than one, if there's more than one hydrant, if there's 2 hydrants, then we've got to increase the water provision up to 150,000 liters plus. Also, you may not draw water from your sprinkler tanks for hydrant provision. So if the client is now responsible for the water provision in the hydrant system, that point must be rationalized. In some instances, a city council will accept a fire plan in which this is detailed, but mostly fire water then has to be rationalized, and an engineer must do the calculations and look at the number of hydrants on that premises, and a rational design must be submitted to the city council for consideration by the rational design committee. And so that's one instance or one example of a point being rationalized. Another example may be, and clients normally financially benefit if a rational design is done on the smoke ventilation or the smoke management. The building regulations require, in some instances, in a warehouse or a factory, for instance, between 1% and 3% of the floor area must be represented in smoke ventilation in the roof. So if the building is 10,000 square meters floor area, then 3% of that must be provided for in the roof for smoke ventilation. Now, if you rationalize it, the calculations are done thoroughly and properly, and you may end up with something equal to 0.8% or 1.1% of floor area. And so it's quite beneficial in most instances for a client to have smoke ventilation rationalized. Rather pay the rational design and get a proper calculation and a proper answer, instead of going for the 3%, giving a capital which is not required. Now, an issue that of late has come up that I believe is at the moment, it's on the books with some metros, is rationalizing the installation of solar panels on a roof. And there are a number of reasons that it has to be rationalized. Number one, it is not contained in the national building regulations yet, and it probably won't be for another 8 years or 10 years. And so what you do when you fit solar panels on a roof is that you compromise the access that the fire crews have when they have to cut into the roof for additional ventilation. And it's a major matter for fire crews. If you cover your entire roof with panels and they can't move about on the roof because the panels are, of course, positively charged with power, then it means that you are forcing the crews into an internal attack instead of an external attack, which means that they need different type of equipment, a different tactical approach. It's a major issue, and it was never considered in the past, but now of late it is an issue, and I expect that the councils are going to say in future that if you cover more than 5% of the roof, you have to submit a rational design. And so we're dwelling, as I said, between rational design and a DTS. So let's say with either one of these two options, the client gets their building plans approved and they build the structure. Now there's a little bit of a catch that the developers come when they erect warehouses, and they declare the warehouse mostly a J3 in terms of the occupancy classifications. And the reasoning that they give, or the motivation, is that we don't know what the building is going to be used for. It's just a warehouse, so it's a J3. But then when the client moves in, they move in with a J2 fire risk. Firstly, that has to be declared to the fire department because there's a change of occupancy. And secondly, the risk is of such a nature that the insurer certainly needs to take notice of that. So let's get back to the fire investigation. So we're appointed as a fire investigator, and one of the things that we look for, because now we're on the side of the insurer who appoints us for the investigation. So one of the first things we look for is that the occupancy classifications were not compromised, because it's a definite no-no come payment date. And so the one instance that I have the one example I've given you already is when a building was declared J3 when it was developed, and it's now become a J2 now that the client has moved in. I'm going to give you another example. So a basement is J4, a basement parking area is J4. But now we go and we install a solar system, an ESS, in the basement, batteries, the whole pack, and the stairwell to the offices is not fitted with a fire door. So if the ESS catches fire, the solar system, the batteries, it means that a J1 risk is now going to spread fire and smoke through a G1 structure, the offices. In effect, the higher occupancy classification now determines the classification of the rest of the building. And so we're sitting with a J4 basement parking, which now becomes a J1. We're sitting with offices over that basement, which now, instead of G1, also become J1. And a J1 mostly is a flammable liquid store. And so if you encapsulate the ESS system with a 2L fire rating, it means that you've got to comply almost with every aspect and every requirement of a flammable liquid store. It includes a fire door, it includes mechanical ventilation. You've got to extract smoke out of that chamber where the ESS is installed in. You've got to extract that smoke and take it beyond the roof, 1.5 meters over the eaves of the roof, so that the smoke is not extracted and pushed into an office window. And so come investigation time, that's one of the issues we look at. Now, you say, but how many fires do we really have in ESS systems? And the answer is that we, as fire ops, operationally deal with, on average, about 8 solar-related fires per month already. And it's increasing. And so the investigating body will look at that chamber very critically if the fire was in the chamber. If you park EVs in your basement, you are adding an enormous risk to the basement. I don't remember the airport. It may have been Schiphol, but it was in Belgium, where 300 cars burnt out and the roof had to be demolished because the rebar was compromised. from that excessive heat from the batteries. So all of these things are being considered during the fire investigation, and they all point back to this one little term that we started using in the beginning, which is called compliance. The insurer also, on the other hand, it mostly comes from the insurer, says to the insured, you have to comply. At somewhere on page 273 or page 79 of the policy document, in small print, it says you must comply in all respects. And it puts the client under pressure whilst there's a lot of misunderstanding, as I have just explained. On both sides, if the client doesn't understand what it means to comply, or that requirement, what it means, and if the insurer isn't altogether certain of what it is that they're saying, it leaves a whole lot of space for speculation. And so now we've built the building, we've submitted a J3 application. Building, the shell stands there, and the Rational Design Committee sends an inspector, one of their own. They inspect the building against the rational design or against the DTS fire plan, and they find that it's an order, and they now issue a what used to be known as a fire clearance certificate. They also now, some councils now refer to that as a COC. The whole COC thing, I'm going to explain just now why it's a bit devious. So the council now issues a fire clearance certificate. It also then hopefully will issue a health clearance certificate, and the town planner will issue a certificate. I think there are 7 departments that issue clearances. And once you've got all the 7 clearances, you can approach the building control officer and request a certificate of occupancy. Now, when that is issued, only at that stage, really, legally, may the electrical town engineer turn power onto that building. Only when a COC, an occupancy certificate is produced. Okay, so let's assume all goes well. The client has got his occupancy certificate, the power is turned on, and the operation starts, and they bring in machines from Belgium and Germany and England and Prisca, and these machines start to operate, and they produce toilet paper. And now we find that the occupancy is compromised. It's now a J3 occupancy. And it's at that point where the client has to have the necessary knowledge to know that here's a problem, here is a challenge. And I want to split hairs here. So you've got 2 insurers mostly at this stage now. You've got an insurer of the structure, the building, and you've got an insurer for the operation. 2 different insurers. Here's the question. If a fire starts and we lay waste to the building, and the fire started in the operation, I don't know the answer. I'm just posing the question. How do the 2 insurers deal with that? If the client or the tenant didn't have the knowledge to know that they've got to declare that their J3 cover is now turned into a J2 risk, it's going to become a massive issue when the investigation is done. Now, I've heard insurers tell me directly that, Wynand, we don't split hairs like that. Mostly we just pay the claim, and I say, which is fine. That's good. But as a consultant, I've got to bring it to the attention of the client and of the insurer that may be a problematic situation then. So let's go back to compliance. We've now got a J2 risk in a J3 building. We declare it. The fire engineer now has to go back. The fire engineer's rational design is now compromised. The fire engineer who holds the rational design has now got to go back to the council and say the operation in here is a J2 operation. A new fire clearance has to be issued. And I venture in most instances, the council say we've got to now review the occupancy certificate as well. It's a very important distinction. Because you may think that the occupancy certificate you're holding is good, but here you're changing the risk to a degree where the occupancy certificate is also compromised. And so now we get to another aspect of compliance. It doesn't affect the occupancy certificate in the beginning, but it does when the operation starts, and that is flammable liquid stores. So flammable liquid stores, classification is J1, and it has to be reviewed by an inspector of the City Fire Brigade yearly. Mostly the permits expire on the 30th of September every year. And so the flammable liquid permits have to be reviewed, to be reissued, reapplied for, and so on. So I want to summarize this by saying that we're looking at a rational design or a DTS fire plan. So we've satisfied all the rules. Plus, we're looking at a fire clearance certificate. Plus, we look at an occupancy certificate. Plus, we look at a flammable liquids permit. Those are the issues that we normally have to have certified in some way or another. From a risk viewpoint, and the risk has very little to do with the building. The risk is mostly in the operation, in the storage of products, in the manufacturing side of it. And now we are, if we manufacture and we store in the same building, it means that there's a dual occupancy classification. Mostly we try to store and manufacture in two separate buildings. If you want to subdivide it, it's got to be a 2-hour fire rated wall. It's got to be a firewall. And a firewall, I want you to please make a note if you can do that, if you're taking notes. A firewall does not extend to the underside of the roof. A firewall protrudes through the roof. It forms a parapet. And in most instances, depending on the risk underneath, in most instances, that parapet has got to be 1.2 meters. If the wall does not extend through the roof, then it's not a firewall. There's a further caveat. If the wall, even if it extends through the roof, if any of the steel structures in the roof run through that wall, it's not a firewall. Because a fire on one side of the building will heat up the structure, it'll expand, and it'll push the wall out in 20 minutes, and the fire will be through the wall anyway. So it's a very complicated issue. Subdividing or compartmentalizing a building is complicated. It's not as easy as it sounds. Then we get to the aspects which is known to most of you. When we look at risk mitigation, we're looking at water provision, hydrants in the first instance, and we're looking at, in some instances, sprinkler system. One, if the building floor area exceeds 2,500 square meters, and two, if the insurer decides or determines that in spite of a smaller floor area, the risk requires that we should have water in the void, in the roof void, in other words, sprinklers or trenchers or total suppression systems, or in some instances, gas. And so now we start looking at those aspects in the risk determination. But I think so far we've been focusing on the building. And so for this morning's discussion, I want to terminate then at that point and open the floor then for questions. And we'll be dealing with risk in the following webinar. So I would like to open the floor, Administrator, for questions. You can type your questions there on the side. It says all the names are there. You can type your questions. Is it under chat that they'll be doing that? Questions and answers only, under chat. So I've got my binoculars on so I can see your questions now if they come in. It'll be sad if I spoke for a half hour and nobody heard me. Can anybody type a note in there on the chat and just tell us that you've heard us? No one. We can hear you. Okay, so somebody heard us. Danny. Danny, you heard us. If anybody else had heard us, if there are questions, then I would gladly take it. If there are no questions, then I either presented really well or I presented really well. Oh.
This is just the chat. Questions on this side.
Okay, so here we said, yes, some people said they saw us, so let's look for the questions. I've been applying for a job. Okay, we won't be dealing with that. Cindy, where can we check if a fire consultant is approved? Now, that's like the politicians normally say, no, that's a brilliant question. So fire consultants are not approved anywhere. So the best we can do is we have an association, it's called ALSA, A-L-S-A, ALSA. It is the Association of Life Safety Assessors. I'm the convener of that. I think we are 76 members in that. And you can check on the website for ALSA and you can pose a question there and give us a name and we'll give you an answer to that. But there's no body. So there's EXA, the Engineering Council for the fire engineers, but there is no equal body for fire consultants. I hope that answers your question, Cindy. Lawrence Swanepoel. Chief, the challenge is to get building plans for old buildings for the planning office. It is a mess. Most people don't keep building plans. I agree with you, Lawrence. What we have found, some cities have excellent records. The city of Johannesburg, unfortunately, has had a calamity. The basement where some of the plans are kept have flooded. And after they were flooded, the basement was flooded. It was also vandalized. But the actual fact is that the building owner should keep their own plans, whether it's a hard copy or electronic copies. It just makes business sense, doesn't it? That you keep your own plans. I mean, for your residential plan, the house that you live in, you've probably got a hard copy somewhere in a safe, and you hopefully, I trust, have a full set of plans electronically in your computer somewhere. So one can say that the councils are negligent in some instances. It's also a fact that some of the buildings that were built in the 80s, for instance, used to be put over onto a FISH system, F-I-S-C-H, I think it was spelled. For those who can remember it, it's like way, way back. Now, if the record is on FISH, it will be worth nothing today. You can't use, it would have been in feet and inches, the measurements anyways, and you can't even use those plans today to draw extensions to your building. So it's a nightmarish topic. But you are so right, Lawrence. It is a massive challenge. Tessa. Hello, Tessa. I hope you're well, friend. Is there a fire engineering body? Yeah, the fire engineers body, as I said, is EXA, the Engineering Council of South Africa. And you can approach them for the names of fire engineers. The SAICE, S-A-I-C-E, the civil engineering body, also has record of some of these individuals. So you can either approach EXA in the first instance, I would suggest that, and then in the second instance, SAICE, to see if the person you're dealing with is registered with that. As I said, us consultants do not have a body. You either trust us and we do a good job, or we don't. But we are expected to have liability insurance anyways. Dion Maritz. If the landlord does not have an existing occupational certificate, is it his responsibility to apply for this and not the tenant's responsibility? It's a catch question, Dion. I would suggest that at the stage that you enter into a rental agreement with the landlord, this question should already be asked. One should not enter into a rental agreement with a landlord that cannot produce an occupancy certificate. So during the stage when due diligence is done, this question must be trampled through. And so I would suggest that that's the first stop for this question. The second thing is that the tenant can probably ask the landlord and hold his feet to the fire, saying that I signed an agreement with you, but I didn't know that you don't have an occupancy certificate. And I expected you'll produce one and make it a civil claims issue or a legal issue. But it's a trick question. Thank you, Dion. Andre Schmidt. Hi, Wynand. Can the insurance insist on sprinklers on any size building, no matter the occupancy classification? Or, for instance, a car dealership that's smaller than 2,500 square meters? Yes, Andre, they can. So the way that let's see who need to be satisfied. Firstly, the building regulations must be satisfied. Then secondly, the insurer must be satisfied, and the insurer can ask almost anything that they want, and I'm going to expand on this now. And then thirdly, the tenant has to satisfy their own appetite for risk. So let's look at my statement about the insurer. So we buy a new car. The new car is sold to us with a roadworthy certificate, which is the baseline safety certificate. And we can now drive the car. Only we need insurance. And now the insurance comes outside and beyond any requirements that the law has for a car. And the insurer says you must fit these systems in your car, anti-hijack and anti-this and anti-that and so on, so on, so on. And then we'll insure you. And then we do it because we want the insurance. And we know that we can't drive this car without the insurance. And so the insurance in this instance then goes beyond a legal requirement. And it's exactly the same with a risk management. The insurer looks at the risk and determines that, yes, in this instance, it's a car dealership. There's 20 a classic car standing there. They probably worth 3.5 million each. We're looking at a risk of 100 million rand here quickly. And we determine that a fixed installation will resolve this issue. And yes, then they can, of course, ask for it. Thank you, Andre. Judy, I'm a layman, so please excuse the basic question. I'm also a layman, Judy, don't worry. I often lay. But we have a property owner in our area building a warehouse for storage of paint in a residential area. Is this allowed? He's using wooden roof trusses. The building cannot be erect legally without a rational design. In that instance, if they already know what the usage is going to be, in other words, they're going to store paint or produce paint or just warehouse it, then the risk is already known as the J2. And so a rational design has to be submitted for that building. And if the rational design was approved by the council, they can build it. The only other question that there is what is the zoning of that erf that they're building on? And that, of course, is not a matter that I discuss. I don't have any knowledge on zoning, or not enough. But if the erf was zoned and if the rational design has been approved, then they can build it. Roof trusses will have formed part of the rational design submission, Judy. Thank you. Peter Marx, I deal with several claims where the house is insured as normal residential. The insured is then operating a business. A very good example of what you are talking about here is, Peter, is the aspect of what do they call the overnight stays? What? Airbnb. Yeah, Airbnb. So we look at a block of flats, and there's 80 flats in this block, and 7 of these operate an Airbnb. It changes the occupancy of that building. And what you are talking about is precisely the same thing. So the tenant has to declare this. They've got to make sure that they declare it to the council, and so that the council can decide whether the occupancy classification has been altered or not. And that new certification has then to be submitted to the insurer. The insurer should ask the question. It's not a question that you leave until the time that there's a fire claim. And I've also seen that. It's a question that has to be asked before you actually insure the building. Is, do you have council approval for this business? And then you can determine whether it's a residence or whether it's a commercial building. And there's a big difference between the fire requirements for a residential building and a commercial building. Thank you, Peter. No more questions. Motsamai, you have a question. What is your question? Seems like it's disappeared. We may have dealt with all the questions. We'll just make sure. I'm not able to work any button on the screen, so Monique is sitting here and she's doing it. So I'll just make sure there's no more questions. And if there's no more questions, we say thank you to all for your attention. I hope it was of value to you.